Thank you all for having me here today. This is my first time at GraphQL Sydney Meetup, so I appreciate the invitation to be here today. The talk that I'm giving today was prepared for ReactConf this year. Actually, it was strange. I was thinking about ReactConf recently and how sort of close that came to the moment when we all realized that we should probably be staying home and not congregating in large groups. So I'm glad we snuck that one in before the global pandemic. But the point I'm getting at is that this presentation was built for a front-end audience. My background is in front-end development. So that's the approach that I've taken. There might be stuff in here that is, you know, familiar, boring. If you've got any questions, I don't know if I can see a Zoom screen, but I can see a Zoom screen. Do the hand thing or chat or just yell over the microphone at any time. I won't consider that an interruption. On with it. I'm Petra. Like I said, my background's in web development. I've spent 10 plus years building websites and apps and APIs and things, and I currently work at the ABC where I draw pictures of websites and apps and things as a solution architect, which is wonderful fun. But over the past couple of years, I've worked on GraphQL projects with both ThinkMill and with Santa Group. And I especially approaching GraphQL as a front-end developer, I think I learned some lessons, some more quickly and others more slowly than I would have liked. Here's a picture of me when we were allowed to leave the country and go outside. Oh, it's the conference jazz. You've got to, all right, okay. Yeah, I had quite a conflict of conscience when I put this together. I feel quite funny about sharing lessons learned and having done things the wrong way. But Eleanor Roosevelt, of all people, said learn from the mistakes of others, because we just don't have time to make them all ourselves. Mistakes like this one here, hopefully no one's GraphQL APIs cause any crisis on this scale, but I took a photo of it, so you don't have to do it. Right, so I've got a section here on what's GraphQL, but we probably all know that, so let's whiz through. As we know, it's a query language as well as the runtime to execute those queries, which is unique for both a vehicle for an API and a data query system. So it's exciting for the front end for several reasons, but my most exciting features of GraphQL are the fact that it's product-centric. Representing your data in a graph means that you have to think about a domain model and relationships between things well ahead of building UI. Being a graph, it's hierarchical, so it's got inherent relationships embedded in it, and you know those relationships before making even any operations on the data. And thirdly, it's schema driven, so that type system that we get in GraphQL is in front-end web technology. It's still quite a new thing. We've experimented with tools like Flow and TypeScript for many years, and in front-end it hasn't quite picked up until this time where GraphQL enters. And all of a sudden, the contract that's established between a client and a server, codified in that schema, is incredibly powerful. For clients, for web clients especially, it means that you can understand whether or not a query is going to execute successfully before you've even made it. So in an environment where network requests are expensive, that can be incredibly valuable. And it means you can write more app without having to write as much code, which I always think is great. I know this is a joke about how React and GraphQL have a very tentative relationship. There's a really wonderful coalescence between, you know, the property system that I use when I'm building a React app and the graph nature of data that I can fetch in GraphQL. But as we've seen through the ways that tools like Apollo evolve, it takes a lot of refining to get there. So this was me, I guess, when I first jumped in. But the number three thing, pardon me, the three top problems that I came across when I was building GraphQL APIs was slow query responses. I guess compared to the excitement of writing a client application, constructing a beautiful query, it's got everything I need in it, fantastic, bam. Why does this take so long? That's a bit of a hard fall. Not knowing what to call things. CJ, your question, I guess, struck on this idea, and Matt explained how hard it was to come up with consistent names for things and when to use types and so on. And the third was error handling. So knowing what to do when things go wrong. REST gives us this set of conventions that we've depended on for a long time when building web apps, but those conventions don't always apply in GraphQL world. So skill number one, what to do with these slow responses. So here's a diagram that we've seen before, and it looks a lot like Matt's product architecture, which makes me really excited because it's a great diagram. The idea is that over on the left here, we've got multiple data sources. Our GraphQL API, our server in the middle, doesn't care what kind of data you attach to it. If you can query it, then you can return it in a GraphQL response. And over on the other side there, you've got all your different client applications. You've got your smart fridge. You've got anything that can make a network request to fetch that data from your GraphQL server. So if we break down a single query, sort of similar to the one that Matt showed us earlier, I've represented a query on the left as a tree over on the right. So say, for example, I've got a user with profile, tracks, email, avatar, and then an artist with some child fields. Now that profile node, it turns out over here, that's asynchronous. So we have to wait for that profile request to resolve on the GraphQL server before the client can hope to expect to receive the response, which also includes the child email and avatar fields. Now the problem is when I'm building a client application, I don't have any visibility over how that graph is resolved. To a client, it looks all the same, but on the server, I might have multiple data sources, different types of requests being executed there, lots of delays in resolving the whole query. So, of course, by nature of combining all these data sources, we're hiding that complexity. But of course, the responses can be delayed by normal weather conditions as well as slow queries. So it's where we're down to like slow internet problems, where we're using intentionally asynchronous services. We're fetching data in multiple requests, but also our database queries can run slowly and our server applications can be overstressed. All of these things will compound and lead to really, really serious delays for your clients. So what do you do? Like Matt said, the first response in a REST sort of world is to put an HTTP cache in front of your API endpoints. But that doesn't work. We've only got one endpoint for a GraphQL API server, and we've got a sort of an infinitely long query parameter on it that describes what we're asking for. So you're going to see diminishing returns in an HTTP cache. Depending on what your applications ask for, it might just work. But if you've got a large set of queries or a set of queries that change over time, which of course is the design principle with GraphQL, then that HTTP cache is not going to work for you. So instead, you're likely going to have to rest on application cache for your GraphQL server, because it's only in that one place in your GraphQL server application that you've got the knowledge of each data source, of each external source, and the delays that might be involved. So if you're paying for Apollo server, or if you have a good logging and monitoring system, it's not too tricky to figure out which of those queries are taking the longest, but ultimately it's going to come down to the knowledge of your graph and your data sources to understand where this application caching needs to be applied for best profit. It's also important to remember when you're building client apps that because we can shape queries as we like, the fact that I can fetch all my data in one request doesn't mean that I have to. So we probably don't want UIs that are making dozens of queries for different granular pieces of data. But for example, you might, for example, you might have a progressive loading pattern. Maybe the first result or the first two results on a list of items could be resolved in one query, and the subsequent list could be fetched in a second query. If your client application developers can have a really good understanding of which points in the graph are going to be slow, then they can code around that, which is nice. So your client application developers are now going to have to be a little bit more intimate with your data sources than they would be if you were providing a REST API. Survival skill number 2, I think getting good at GraphQL is going to require getting good at domain modeling. Because our schema can be built incrementally, and because we're developing a schema that's agnostic of a client application, we've got a really unique opportunity to model our data, not in terms of modeling or database constraints, but in terms of the domain of our business, of our organization or our product. So for example, Matt talked about the concept of a property. Now what that property looks like for an agent or a tenant or a manager could be very different. But to the business, to the domain, that instance of a property remains the same. The data fields that exist on that property are universal. So with GraphQL, we have the opportunity now to be more granular about how we break down that model, and take the time, I guess, to choose the words, the names for things that that describe interactions beyond what your app does, if that makes any sense. So when we're modeling a domain, we've got 4 things to worry about. We've got the names of things, we've got the connections or the relationships between things, we've got concerns about listing things, and making mutations or making changes to things is also pretty hot. Now, this is really the hot spot over here. Making changes, pardon me, to entities in a GraphQL schema is represented by mutations. And those mutations can be generic or they can be specific. We can have an update, a catch-all mutation that's called update, or we could have something that updates a specific field on a specific type. Now, what we choose to implement there is going to be dependent on our team. But it took me a while, I think, to realize here that while we've got in REST, we've got 4 operations that can represent either, I guess, a query or a change to an entity in a data graph. That doesn't really scale very well to the range of things that a user can do when interacting with your app. So it's important to remember that GraphQL gives us really fine-grained control over those operations, and not to be limited by put and post. So when I talk about the user behavior being described by the operation, I've got an example over here. An update profile mutation might suggest that I can update any field on that profile. I'm not necessarily sure what input needs to be provided, or you know, if that's a generic mutation that's used in multiple places, I might find that I have a set of mandatory and optional fields. As soon as that happens, the contract starts to break down with the client and we've got problems. But if I have a mutation that's more specific, for example, a mutation that adds track to profile, then I have ultimately a smaller schema, because I can encapsulate that operation with fewer input fields. So does that mean, I guess in a CJ you asked, so does that mean that everything that I can do or see when it comes to an app UI needs to be represented in the schema? And does that mean especially I need an operation or a mutation for every interaction? And the short answer is yes. If you've got a data operation that makes sense in your domain model, then it should be represented in your schema, because ultimately your schema is a representation of that domain model. Survival tip number 3. We're almost at the end. Knowing what to do with errors. So how embarrassing when you get a 200 response and you don't get any data back. Again, maybe it's because of my background in front end, but it took me a while to realize that nuance in a GraphQL's error messaging. So your GraphQL API server application needs to be really explicit about what to do when it encounters errors. You know, with any kind of basic API server application, you've got a basic set of network errors that can occur. You've got application errors that can occur, and IO errors and whatnot. But now, if we've got a GraphQL server API that connects to multiple data sources, I've suddenly multiplied all of those errors that can occur. So that's important to keep in mind, that those errors should be passed to the client in a consistent way and in a complete way. If you have a setup where a client can receive an incomplete query, i.e. like maybe some of their data returned but the rest didn't, then that error messaging becomes even more important for clients. Oh yeah, sorry, like I said, so that server errors, network errors and so on, that they're not new. They're the same kinds of errors we've always been handling, but we do have new types of errors introduced when we're using GraphQL. That, you know, we've got a bit of schema validation to do. We've got a lot of things to check when a query comes in from the client, and a lot that can go wrong along the way before we even consider that things can go wrong in the tooling itself. So in summary, that it's really important now that we have technology like GraphQL that allows us to share knowledge of a schema between front end and back end, but we also have the level of cooperation that means that client developers can be aware of constraints and delays in the back end and can learn to adapt their requests to match. Secondly, you really want to design your schema to match your domain, not a specific application. Don't forget user behaviors, and make sure you're handling errors in the client application. You can only do that successfully if you've implemented them well on the server. It's been mentioned, there's a really huge community, I guess, now behind Apollo tools, but there are others out there. The coverage of tools for GraphQL across client platforms is pretty amazing. And it's incredible how quickly it's happened. Your API documentation comes for free. You don't need any swagger. GraphQL doesn't care about your transport method, which means that we can do things like query our local state using a GraphQL query that looks exactly the same as one that we might use to query a server. It's pretty exciting. Ultimately, the major selling point is that you can write less code and get more app. I love hearing when people were able to add new client apps, like Matt explained that he did, without making any server changes. I think that's pretty exciting for us as a tribe. So thank you, everyone. I hope that that wasn't too much of a front end perspective, but yeah, happy to answer anyone's questions or dive into any more detail if anyone has got any questions for me.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. Just have a question about the tools. You mentioned has plenty of tools. Are there any particular tools that you use or you would recommend? Any sort of like code generators or anything that helps you as a front-end developer to build better, more app and less code, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I do have. I've got a list actually. I can share in Slack if you want after this.
Yeah, that'll be great.
Cool. Yeah, obviously Apollo tools are probably most popular and most effective on the front end. But there, yeah, like I said, there's others out there.
Anyone else got any questions for Petra?
Maybe I can ask you another one. So what's your setup like? Do you use any sort of, like on the back end, do you use any sort of framework or any like GraphQL generator, or like how does it work on the back end in your company? What do you use?
I'm not, this talk is based on projects that I carried out in previous roles. At the moment, I'm not working on GraphQL APIs, which is sad news for me.
Okay. But when you used to, what did you use like
yeah, Apollo Server and associated tools were, I think, the most useful. I tried various combinations of Express and Apollo to try and come up with an optimal approach. I found the middleware paradigm to be really strange at first, but I got used to that, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, I'll share that list of tools. I think it should have some hints.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Hello, Petra. I would like to, because I'm very new in ReactConfAU, I just saw it this morning. I'm working the app. They use Sparkle query to query in the triple store. And in the front end, we use free marker to display the result from the Sparkle query API. But when they upgrade and in the middleware, they use GraphQL to query, and that file will be transferred to JSON, and this JSON file will be rendered into ReactJS. And I would like to ask if I can use the Sparkle API, and you transfer to JSON file, and that JSON file can be displayed in ReactJS, or we need to use the ReactConfAU?
Oh, I'm not sure on the details of the question that you're asking there. Do you want to chat further in Slack after the call? Are you around on the Slack organization?
Because in Sparkle Query API, they query from the triple store like the ontology. And I'm a bit wonder about the database when the ReactConfAU you to query. What's the database like? the format of the database is in the table or look like on triple store ontology?
Oh, sorry, I'm not sure I'm catching. I don't think I can answer that for you in a straightforward way.
You just gave me the example of the database and the example of GraphQL query. Can you share me that one?
What an example of a GraphQL schema?
Yep, that's one.
Look, I can find a link for you. I'm happy to chat further. I'm sure that lots of us in the room here would have some advice if you're just starting out. Are you part of the GraphQL Slack organization? Maybe we can keep talking there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Paul, is there a link that you can share to that Slack log?
Yeah, I saw your Twitter or LinkedIn or something like that.
Yeah, I've just shared it to the chat there,
Okay.
Jane. So feel free to click on that and come on the Australia channel of the Slack there, and then you can go over your question in some more details.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Cool. That's all from me.